All right, hello everyone. Welcome in. It's time for our sports and leisure history look back. We'll be looking back at the history from the week of June 15th. As always, I'm Jeff Klein. I'm joined with my good friend Clayton Hamilton. How you doing, Clayton?
I'm doing great. Always loving lots of sports, moderate leisure, but mostly sports for me.
The leisure is when you sit on your couch and watch the sports, right?
Yeah, it's when I make ribs or chicken or steak or whatnot. You know, I am going hiking soon, so that's going to be leisurely, maybe the downhill part anyway.
We had I posted some great footage a while back. Felt like I needed to post some more leisure, and so one of these people going downhill on the side of a mountain. Felt like that was leisure. But today we have a great show. We're going to mix it up with some golf, some motorsports, some baseball, and I kind of felt like all these three categories are kind of a Venn diagram to bring back bullpen cards. Remember those?
I do remember the bullpen card. It was quite popular in the late 70s, even into the early 80s, and plays a pivotal role in the plot of Major League, the movie, with Charlie Sheen and Tom Berenger.
Yeah, I felt like, was it a few years ago they were talking about making a comeback with bullpen cards? There was some chatter about that, right?
Yeah, Washington, I believe, had one, or maybe still does, and I think they tinkered around with one in Toronto. What's crazy to me, though, is that Mitsubishi or Honda or Toyota has not made one specifically for Shohei Ohtani, just to bring him in from the warm-up bullpen to the dugout. It seems like a missed opportunity.
That would be golden, at least in Japan. I don't know if here, but in Japan, it seems like those things would sell like crazy.
Yeah,
you're right.
You think somebody's missing out in Japan, because I'm sure what Japan needs more is more Ohtani endorsements on their television. I'm sure there's probably not enough.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I had a friend who just went to Japan, and he kept telling me how much Ohtani and Yamamoto are just like everywhere in Japan, like everywhere.
It reminds me of Lost in Translation, as Bill Murray is going around town and he constantly sees his face. I think that's exactly what it's got to be like for those guys.
Yeah. All right, well, let's jump in. We're going to kick it off with some golf, and wanted to talk about back in 1960 on June 18th, Arnold Palmer, the great Arnold Palmer, won his only U.S. Open in dramatic and historic fashion. A come-from-behind victory, overcoming a seven-stroke deficit to catch leader Mike Suchek and fend off Jack Nicklaus, Gary Player, and Ben Hogan, some of the all-time greats in golf. And this all happened during the first ever live nationwide NBC television broadcast. Pretty fantastic golf there. Some big names in the sport.
Yeah, there were huge names. And it wasn't just any comeback. Let's not overlook the 7-shot deficit that Arnold Palmer had. And he had joked around with the press pool that he thought if he shot 65 on that day that he had a chance. And the pool reporters sort of laughed at him and joked around with him that was very wishful thinking. And then he went out and shot a 65 and won the tournament.
But it was almost like destiny for the sport, because he was such a marketable personality, and that huge dramatic win really kind of put golf on the map during that time, right?
It did, because golf up until that point, really in the late 50s, there was sort of media televised coverage. There was radio coverage for sure, but then there would be, maybe we will have the last hole and we'll just shoot the last hole for an hour on the last round, and that will be the golf coverage. Or they would shoot it and edit it together, and you might get a half-hour highlight package of what happened in the tournament. But most of the time, you got your golf news at the movies, when you would go and you would see the newsreel, and they would have sports highlights and world event highlights, and all of a sudden you would have, some, political protest and bombing somewhere in the world or war news, and then it would be like, Gene Saracen shot 68 at Pinehurst. Not even the blustery winds could stop him. Boy, it looks cold. Maybe another blanket for that little fella. He's put on 18 and he's won the championship. Oh, what a golfer. And that would be it. Like, that would be it.
Yeah, great old-timey voice by
I love old newsreel footage. It doesn't matter, what it is, like the old newsreel guy, because he can take the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the U.S. Open Golf Championship and make them sound exactly the same.
Right. Well, and I think most fans sort of think about sort of marketing and sports branding, and we think of Michael Jordan's obviously probably the biggest example of that with Air Jordans and Nike, and it's kind of funny you mentioned Otani and the Mitsubishi golf cart that we think would be a great idea, and how he's branded all over Japan, and there's a lot of big examples of that in sports, but Arnold Palmer was really the first really global athlete that looked at his image as a brand asset. And his agent, Mark McCormick, they made a deal that Arnold Palmer would be his only client. And that was just, at least early on, and that was really the start of modern sort of sports marketing. They founded IMG, and then that's really, that whole industry was kind of born around this personality. But he was really the first athlete to really look at himself that way as someone that fans could connect to year round, not just what happened after the tournament win and they're going to sort of bank off of that success. But this was a year round brand and marketing campaign.
Yeah, Mark McCormick is one of the most important people in sports history. And like you said, there's so many people that think that Michael Jordan invented marketing, and they think that Nike invented marketing, and it's just not so. Arnold Palmer is the OG. And right. Mark McCormick really started with golf, and he said, it was just going to be him and Arnold Palmer, but that quickly changed, and he had Jack Nicklaus and Gary Player. So he had all the golf guys, and they started, hey, well, how can we use these golf guys to market products and create exhibitions and live events? And that morphed into IMG. And a lot of people are probably familiar with IMG now. It's no longer owned by Mark McCormick. He sold it for, I think, $1.25 billion to Endeavor Sports Agency, who has conglomerated that with a number of other business interests. And they're over a wide variety of sports, everything from the U.S. Open, they do the Giro d'Italia, they do MotoGP, they do PGA Europe, even things like Stars on Ice, the FA Cup. They took over Miss Universe, Miss America, Miss Teen USA. They run those pageants. And IMG has its own academy now. A lot of these IMG players from football and from basketball. It started with golf, and it started with tennis. So the original idea was they took and purchased Nick Bollettieri's tennis academy, which produced a number of tennis players down in Florida, and just replicated that for golf and for basketball and for football, and now have 400 and something acre campus down in Florida that houses these athletes, teaches them their schoolwork, and creates their branding before they even get drafted.
Yeah, and to sort of give people a sense of how successful Arnold Palmer was in his branding and marketing, it's estimated that over his lifetime he made $1.3 billion in endorsements. And this is, nowadays it's a big number even by today's standards, but obviously we're in a, era of 100 contracts or hundreds of millions of dollars. But we're talking about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, where you just, athletes didn't amass that kind of money. But the unique thing about Arnold Palmer is he looked at himself as really a brand spokesman for so many different products and so many different industries, from automobiles to, you name it. And he attached his image if he felt that it was a good product to be associated with, because he was really conscious of sort of that image, and he was very careful about who he was and who he was in front of the public eye. And I think he had a unique sort of everyman blue collar quality that American fans could really gravitate towards, and that really helped sort of lead into making the Open Championship really popular for American golfers to go play in the United Kingdom, and he made it as, if you don't win the Open Championship, if you're not competing against international players, then you're not a complete golfer. And it's that global approach to the sport that I think really helped him, and he's really the first one who looked at it that way.
Yeah, because not only did he look at expanding American golf fans' knowledge of golf around the world, he also wanted to introduce European fans to American golfers and thus American products. And he was really kind of smart in that way of saying, hey, well, let's use the Open and let's get away from the PGA trying to compete with the Open by putting the PGA Championship the same time as the Open so that these guys can go and play. And he was very successful in working with the PGA in order to make sure that all of these events had their proper place on the calendar. And he was really good at that. And so many people, like you said, liked him because he wasn't a Ivy League, unobtainable, untouchable rich guy. His dad was a greenskeeper at a golf course, which is how he got the entry into golf, something he never would have been able to afford or do if his dad wasn't able to get him, sort of free time on the course. So a lot of people really gravitated towards him and rallied around him, and it sort of became a star-driven sport, maybe in a way that golf necessarily hadn't been in the past.
Yeah, because it was really sort of a gentleman's game, and he had a very demonstrative personality on the course. He had very emotional body language, and he was also sort of a risk taker in golf. So, he built up that drama, and he knew what he was doing. He knew it was good for TV. You had the wide world of sports coming into sort of being, and that really, all these factors sort of collided to show networks that, hey, this is a very marketable sport. We could play it live, and I think he took some of that knowledge and some of that insight, and he co-founded the Golf Channel as well.
Yeah, he did. He was a huge proponent of that and getting golf on television and seen not just on the final Sunday. But Golf Channel, one of the great things about it even today is if you want to watch the Thursday and Friday before the cut, there's now a place for you to do that, which didn't exist before. But also, let's not sort of dismiss the importance of how exciting the 1960 tournament was that got all of this in motion. Because there's one thing that we know, right, that television executives are not exactly the most ingenious, brightest people on the planet, right? They do not get things before they're things. If they look at something, they can't say, hey, this is growing and in 3 years it's going to look like this. They can only look at how do I replicate what worked yesterday. That's their mindset, and that's why it takes a long time for innovation, because not too many people in the television world are creative. So for it to be as exciting as it was at the time that it was, starting with the very first hole that was 346-yard par 4, and Arnold Palmer steps up with a wooden driver and cranks one 20 feet from the cup, drives the green, birdies 6 of the first 7 holes, and all of a sudden, now we've got pressure of all of these guys, and there were 14 of them that were ahead of him that day, are all now playing under pressure, trying to chase Arnold Palmer and creating compelling television.
Yeah, and I think another legacy that probably gets overlooked is he did a lot for other golfers' success, because he pushed a lot of these tournaments, and the Open Championship was one of them. He told them you need larger purses to attract high class players and top talent, and if you do that, it's going to benefit everyone. You're not going to be spending more money on purses. You're going to be raking in more money in revenue and growth of the sport. And I think that's one of his legacies in really growing the sport of golf.
Yeah, it certainly was. And for on top of it, for him to be the best player at the time for that period of time, because 1960 was really when it was a changing of the stars in golf. And that Ben Hogan, who was in contention on the final day, he was sort of at the end of his career. And Jack Nicklaus was just starting. He was 20 years old as an amateur. Nicklaus ended up coming in second on the day. And, Ben Hogan had a 6 and a 7, a bogey and a triple bogey right at the end on 17 and 18 to drop out. But it was this colliding of the old still had the star power, and we were defining who the new guys were, and then there were the people like Arnold Palmer right in their prime. And so it really gave a sort of 3-tiered interest and approach to creating these stars.
Yeah, for sure. And we associate him with some of the all-time greats. As we mentioned, he was in that competition with Gary Player and Jack Nicklaus, but he seemed to separate himself even from the greats, right? He seemed to be, and they called him the king, right? Because he was, it all stems from Arnold Palmer.
And just to let you know, Jeff, before we move on, how good that tee shot was on number 1 at Cherry Hills that he drove the green 20 feet from. In, I think it was 2014, they had another tournament at Cherry Hills, and they took all the top pros, and they gave them an Arnold Palmer driver from 1960 and balls from 1960, and they set the tee box up in the same spot, and they cut the hole in the same spot, and they all let him take a whack at it. And the closest person to replicate his shot of 20 feet from the green, or from the hole, it's not near the green, from the hole, 20 feet from the hole, was Rory McIlroy, who was 49 yards from the green. Wow. Not just the hole, 49 yards from the green. Right. And Arnold Palmer was, 20 feet from the green. And just seeing those guys with an old wooden driver, like how do you hit with this tiny driver and these balls that were not designed for extra flight? And Arnie, 20 feet, Rory, 49 yards.
Yeah, it's such a unique story, and we'll never see an athlete like him in any sport, because not only did he have the mix of skills and IQ for the sport and appreciation and the reverence for what he brought to the sport and what he brought to the public eye. He had the ability to attract fans like he did. It's hard to find anyone who would ever say anything negative about him. He had such an identification with his fan base that they even had a nickname called Arnie's Army, right? And they had almost this, and I don't want to say this in a negative way because this is usually a negative term, but almost a cult-like worship of him, just because of how obsessed they were with him as a golfer. And that's really something, considering what we had just talked about, is that in the 50s, golf wasn't really on the map much. And he basically brought in these generations of fans that have lasted till now. Yeah,
he was the beginning, like I said, of golf, of being on your television every day. And he was the beginning of the star athlete and the marketable athlete that translated beyond golf to any number of other individual sports, and then sort of found its way into team sports.
So I want to move on, because this is a good transition to another history post that we had, but moving over to motorsports. And actually we had 2 posts on motorsports, but the first one really gets to sort of the roots or sort of the rebirth of auto racing. And so I love this first one because, I'm I'm not the biggest racing fan, but I do love the history and origins of racing a lot. I find it really fascinating. I find that more interesting than maybe the races themselves. And so on June 19th, we posted that back in 1949, the very first strictly stock motorsport race was sanctioned by the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR as we call it. And the NASCAR Cup Series was born. Glenn Dunaway took the checkered flag but was later disqualified post-race due to how he had manipulated his car and violated the rule book. And so the trophy was given to second place Jim Roper, and he was declared the winner. And then we had a second post later in the week on June 21st, 1981. A.J. Foyt won the Pocono 500. It was his 67th and final win in the Champ Car Series, which is now known as IndyCar. And 67 IndyCar wins still stands as a record. But going back to 1949, let's talk about that first, because that's really when auto racing really started catching on and attracting a lot of fans and really growing from there, right?
Well, it was the first time that it sort of fell under one governing body in stock car racing. Now, when you get to auto racing, it's hard to figure out who's in charge because each series is completely different. Your F1 series is run by a group in Europe, and that covers rally cars, which is like the Baja 1000, those trophy truck off-roads, and that's all falls under a governing body. And then there's NASCAR, and there's IndyCar, and there's 24-hour racing, and there's dirt racing, and then there's MotoGP. So it all of these sort of stemmed out of needing to have a governing body. And for all those other ones that have since created theirs, NASCAR was really one of the first, because AAA, AAA, like we still have today, AAA Auto Insurance,
right.
Those guys, they were running NASCAR, AAA was, and they were running Formula One in Europe until the FIA started and said, you know what, hey, we kind of need to govern ourselves. And so this was a huge moment when Bill France Sr. decided, hey, we need a governing body. Instead of having all of these little tracks running independently all over the South and Midwest, we need to create a general rule book and a governing body and create a series and turn this into a traveling carnival that goes from place to place to place to place to place, instead of just doing one-off events with different promoters and different rules all over the place at the same time.
So I'm kind of disappointed to hear about AAA's history, because all I can say is the person who came out and changed my tire from AAA did not change it as quickly as the pit crew changes the tires on the track. So I'm a little disappointed in that individual.
Yeah, they're not so much involved in the racing anymore. But I find that funny too. That AAA was sanctioning auto races around the country. But Bill France is really the guy that is responsible for the creation of NASCAR. And in some ways, I think IndyCar and, Champ Cars and all of those sort of looked to what NASCAR was doing. Even though the things like the Indianapolis 500 existed and open wheel racing existed, it didn't really exist in the series format necessarily the way that NASCAR created with this 1949 race. And to NASCAR's credit, they sort of did this in 1948, and they said, you know what, we're not going to just create everything right away. We're going to take a year and figure out what we're doing, because we have no idea what we're doing. And we're going to go around the country, and we're going to see these races, and we're going to see these tracks, and we're going to work ourselves in to starting this series in 1949. Even though they probably could have done it in 48, it would have been a mess. So good on Bill France for taking his time to figure out how to create a series. And this was the first race of that series. Still running today.
Yeah. And they were really clever in how they did it. And they said, it could only be American cars in the race. Mm-hmm. And they had to be from 1946 to 1949. It could be Lincoln. It could be old Ford, something called Hudson, Cadillac. even Jeep convertibles. But they wanted to really appeal and attract American fans and make it an American-centric race. And the stock car angle was interesting because, the as you know, and some people may know, stock cars really, stock from the factory, right? And so they had very minimal changes that you could make to it. And that was on purpose because they wanted fans to sort of relate to it, right? You would be driving around in a car similar to what you watched on TV. They had a saying, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. So it was all geared around attracting fans, making it relatable to the fans, making racing this something that wasn't this Eurocentric sort of sport that American fans could really sort of rally around and get behind. And I kind of was thinking of something similar where you see those old, you don't see this much anymore, but the old days of baseball where we're playing stickball in the street and the kids are relating to the baseball players, pretending to be, Willie Mays or a player like that. And it was, it had some similarities for me because it was trying to get fans, your average fan watching these races to relate to the drivers and to relate to the cars. And then they marketed everything, the track, the cars. They brought in sponsors that really appealed to sort of the blue collar, everyday fan.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think grew out of this that maybe wasn't the intention when they had first started, I think what they, going back to that race on Sunday, sell on Monday, that I think the original thought is people are going to be fans of manufacturers. And if you drive an Oldsmobile, you're going to root for Oldsmobile. And if you drive a Ford, you're going to root for Ford. And we all know anybody that saw Ford versus Ferrari. That's really what that was all about. It was about manufacturers, having a contest to see who was bigger and who was better. And it was really about brand loyalty to Ferrari or to Ford in that case, or domestically, clearly, Cadillac, Oldsmobile. But what they realized is that people gravitated to people, not to a particular car. And that it was really the drivers that were becoming the stars, and it was the driver that you were going to see. You didn't really care so much what his car was. And I know there are still NASCAR guys now that are like, I'll never root for a Toyota, or I'll never, or whatever it is, and like that exists, and that's fine. But that's a small, I think, portion of it, right, that they will follow their driver to whatever manufacturer or whatever team. You follow the driver. It's not even like brand loyalty. Like, I love M&Ms and I'm going to root for the M&Ms whenever the M&M car is out there. It's like you're going to root for the driver. And if your driver changes and now he's, interstate batteries, so you're like, it doesn't matter to you. You're not going to be like, I hate interstate batteries, I can't root for him. You're gonna root for the driver, and that's something that I think they figured out in all forms of auto racing, which is where somebody like AJ Foyt really benefited. Is that AJ Foyt on the IndyCar side became a huge star across multiple platforms of racing, and it didn't matter if he was racing 24 Hours of Le Mans, or if he was racing IndyCar open wheel, or if he was racing NASCAR. People followed AJ Foyt wherever AJ Foyt went and to whatever series he was in.
Yeah, and drivers got sort of a personality associated with them, just like any athlete. And we know that fans love to follow athletes and they get attached to athletes. And to your point, drivers, that's something that racing realized. Drivers also have these personalities. And, AJ Foyt was known as this tough-nosed, kind of stubborn, authentic driver who really connected with fans. A lot of stories about him really going out of way for fans. But then he was also extremely successful in terms of his resume. Probably one of the most complete drivers ever. He's actually the only driver to win the Indy 500, the 24 Hour of Le Mans, the Daytona 500, and the 24 Hours of Daytona, which just shows his sort of really wide skill set and vast abilities.
One of the things that was always great about AJ Foyt is that he was the driver that could take his car apart himself and put it back together. And he was involved in all of the aspects of how his car was set up, where he was going to run, when he was going to run. And it translated really well after he had finally stopped driving into becoming an IndyCar team owner and crew chief. And he's intimately involved in not just sort of the driver's preparation, but in how the car is set up and how what technological advancements they're making within the car, because he understands all of those aspects of it. But AJ Foyt was one of those guys. Like I said, he was a Texas son of a rancher and very relatable. And that's something that really NASCAR has been very good at, is marketing to people that see themselves on the track, right? We always hear that, right? They're like, well, I didn't know I could do it until I saw somebody that looked like me doing it, and a lot of people see themselves and see their background is very similar to a lot of the driver's background, and that makes them very relatable. And they've been extremely successful in marketing to their core base.
Yeah, I think that the sort of add on to that, they've made racing really accessible. And you have these races going on in these tiny communities all over the country, and they relate, like we've been saying, they relate to the drivers. And I think whether it's NASCAR or other racing platforms, they are aware of how they connect with fans and how they connect with a lot of these communities, and no community is too small for them to market to, where I think you don't see that in other sports as much, where they sort of go for the most efficient way to market their team, and then if they lose some fans along the way, that's okay. The teams have sort of maximized what they could with their resources. But I think the approach racing has taken over the last probably half century or longer is really to make it accessible, make it relatable, like we've been talking about, and to build up these people like AJ Foyt, Mario Andretti. And I think AJ Foyt didn't really have the sort of slick appeal that Mario Andretti did, and Andretti was probably a little more TV friendly, but they know that, and they're realistic about their drivers, and they know how to position their drivers in front of the cameras and on the track to make them kind of a star in their own right.
Right, and like I said, it's something for everybody. You're an AJ Foyt guy, or I'm a Mario Andretti guy, because look at the cool watch he has, and look at the leather boots, and Mario Andretti, he's who I want to be. And they've been very successful, and they, just like golf, were really good in using television in order to tell their story, because I always remember my grandparents talking about the Indy 500 was that was a huge day at the house, but it wasn't on TV until really in the mid 80s. So for most of their life, it was a cookout and listening to it on the radio. And then they started to put together, an hour-long highlight package. So the Indy 500 would air the next day for an hour, and you could watch the highlights of the race. And then it got to be, okay, we're going to show you the first 10 laps, and then we're going to go show you something else on Wide World of Sports, and then we're going to come back for the last 10 laps. Until it got to the point of where, okay, well, now we're going to show the whole race live because it's getting phenomenal ratings. And the same with NASCAR. We're going to show you the full Daytona 500, and now we're going to show you every race. And now every single race on the NASCAR series and every single race from the IndyCar series, they're on every week, every one of them. And they used television to create that fan base, even if it's in a smaller niche group than maybe basketball or football. It's a incredibly loyal group, and they've done a marvelous job of not just using television, but now using phone apps and extra cameras and streaming to give access to a group of people that want it.
Don, I want to ask you a question, because in the past you've mentioned that you're not much of a Formula One guy. Mm-hmm. Do you think the biggest divide in racing right now is sort of the European versus the American tracks or races? Do you think that's the sort of where the big divide exists?
Yeah, I do. There is a European snobbery that exists and is only growing by the day. Of if it's American, it's garbage, right? That's and it doesn't matter if it's actually garbage or not. It's just that we're European, and so our cars are better, and therefore our races are better. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think that it's helped, at least with IndyCar in Europe, that there have been a number of European drivers that have come from Formula One over to, because there's more drivers than there are rides in Formula One. And so there's a number of those drivers that have come over and have started running IndyCar. Not so much NASCAR. Like, we haven't seen the Jean Girard from Talladega Nights. Like, we haven't really seen that. There might be a handful of Europe, but we haven't seen it in the same way that there is. But I just, for some reason, like, the European mind when it comes to racing is all about watching the clock, not the track. It's weird to me because it's the same thing of, like, they love time trials, right? So even in cycling, they love time trials where it's like one guy at a time. In cross-country skiing, they love one guy at a time, the old school cross-country skiing. It was years before there was a mass start in cross-country skiing or biathlon. Yeah. It was like one dude at a time, the whole race. You'd sit there for like 5 hours and watch them go one at a time until the television window is like, we need to tighten this up, right? Yeah. And so they started doing mass starts, which really appealed to America and Canada, and some of the rest of the world was like, oh, okay, well, this is really interesting when they're all going at the same time. Right. So I don't know what it is about, like I said, about Europe, that they look at NASCAR and they're like, oh my God, they're just going around in a circle. That's dumb. But there's so many things that can happen in a NASCAR race that is not just a parade lap, that has to do with where you've qualified. And that's really what Formula One is. There's very few passing. It all has to do with the way that you build your car. See, in IndyCar and in NASCAR, like, there are standards, right? And everybody's fairly equal, and there's minimal tweaks you can do. So it's a lot about what is your efficiency in the pits and how good of a driver you are and what strategy you're going to use. Like in IndyCar, they make you change tires. Like, they'll give you, like, all right, you have to use this compound of tire at least twice and this compound of tire at least once. And you have to run X amount of laps on it. So it's when do you use those laps? How often do you change it? What kind of mileage do you get out of your tires? There's a lot of strategy and thinking, and different teams are on different strategies and which one's going to work. In Formula One, you can basically build your own car. Right. And there's not a whole lot that is taboo in it. So the more money you have, the better your car is, and the more you win, which is why you see, like, kind of the same guys winning all the time. And you don't really see guys changing a lot of positions in a race because the best car wins, not the best driver or the best strategy. It's like the most money. So I don't know. I think if Formula One would take some lessons from IndyCar and NASCAR, which they will never do, because no good idea can come from the United States if you're Formula One. They've already done us a favor by having 3 races here, which is 3 too many, right? So I don't know that Formula One will ever really capture the American consciousness as long as it continues to be as snobby as it is.
Well, first I want to say, thankfully in horse racing there's no time trials. They let all the
they let them all right, exactly, right? But yeah, no, they love it. They love time trials. It's the weirdest thing. Because I'm always like that in the Tour de France when it's time trial day. I'm always like, I kind of usually watch the highlights, but yeah, they love it. Oh, they love it. But
well, I think some of what you mentioned is really takes us back to what we were just talking about with 1949 and trying to sort of get away from that European-centric model where it was all about spending money on your car and who could build the nicest car from scratch. That was the from scratch. That was the fastest, and really about making it a stock car that was relatable to what a lot of people were driving, or you have your street car that you take out racing on the weekend and you want to tweak it to make it similar to what you watched on TV. So I think there's a lot there that you kind of point to that still relevant today, but really has the origins going back to the 1940s. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about some football.
Okay.
And I know summer's not time to talk about football, but we do have a football history post.
Not if you're every other national show who must talk about football every single day.
That's true. That's true. Fortunately, we talk about all sports here on the Sports and Leisure, so we don't have that detriment. But it was the end of an era, 1994, at least for the New York Giants, because on June 15th, Phil Simms, my New York Giants son, Phil Simms, winner of 2 Super Bowls, although really he played in 1, was cut from the New York Giants. It was his 14th season with the Giants, and he placed 8th in MVP voting the previous season, but he had suffered a torn labrum and required surgery. He was expected to be ready for training camp ahead of the 1994 season in that fall. However, the Giants decided to release Simms to save $2.5 million against the cap. It was a recently new rules in the NFL with the cap. And so they decided to go with quarterback Dave Brown, and didn't really necessarily go that well with Dave Brown. But Phil Simms, were you a big fan of Phil Simms?
I did. I liked Phil Simms. I thought that was a fun time in the NFC East. I really enjoyed Randall Cunningham and Phil Simms, and the Redskins were great at that time, and the Cowboys. And so it was a pretty fun time in that age. I think it was the kind of the end of Danny White, and it was pre-Troy Aikman for the Cowboys. So they were lagging a little bit behind, but it was a fun time. It was sort of when I felt like football was at its best, and football was the most enjoyable for me to watch. Was during that time from the early '80s up until about the mid to late '90s. Really before Roger Goodell came in and started tinkering and ruining football. That was sort of the golden era for me.
So I think you may know this, but I was a New York Giants were my favorite team growing up, and when I was in middle school and starting to really watch football, I was a big fan of defense and Lawrence Taylor. I loved Lawrence Taylor, still my favorite player all time, and so I watched a lot of when they were on TV. It's a little harder to catch the games. Never got into sort of the mystique of the Raiders that were popular in LA, and the Rams. I didn't really feel like we're an LA team because they were down in Orange County at that time. So, I maybe have a higher appreciation of Phil Simms than sort of what he really accomplished on paper, on the field. His intangibles to me were a little bit better than probably his statistics reflected. But do you think that if he didn't get injured and we didn't have Jeff Hostetler come in for that second Super Bowl that the Giants won during that era, do you think Phil Simms would be in the Hall of Fame?
I think he might be with that second Super Bowl if he won it. I think there are a couple of things that hurt Phil Simms when it comes to his Hall of Fame candidacy. And let me first say that I agree with the Hall of Fame voters that he is not a Hall of Famer, even though I think he's close. And I think it's odd sort of when you first think about it, you just sort of automatically assume that he's in. And then you're like, oh yeah, no, he's not in. And I am not, as you know, I am not always a defender of the Hall of Fame voters in any sport. Just go back a couple of weeks and watch our Dale Murphy if you want to see me not be a Hall of Fame supporter. But that the not making be playing in that Super Bowl, the subsequent stats that he lost and during the time that he was injured, that he stalled at 199 touchdowns, and he has 33,000 yards. If he had had those extra games and maybe gotten over 35,000 and was somewhere in the neighborhood of 224, 225 touchdowns and 2 Super Bowls that he played in with him being the MVP of 1, I think he probably gets in. But given that none of those things are the case, he is, on the list of guys that are on the outside looking in.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the injuries overall, not just for that second Super Bowl, I don't think it would have been enough for him to be in that second Super Bowl. Although let's not forget he had one of the greatest quarterback performances in Super Bowl history with his was it Super Bowl 21, and where they routed the Broncos 39-20, and he threw he completed 22 of 25 passes, 3 touchdowns. Pretty incredible performance in that Super Bowl. But I think you're right. With the injuries also in other parts of his career, probably took away some of his numbers. He has a pretty low passer rating of about 78.5. And I was looking at what other Hall of Fame quarterbacks have sort of a lower passer rating, and you're looking at like Terry Bradshaw, but he's got a lot of other sort of lists on his resume that kind of make a case for him. Or you have Joe Namath, and he's an iconic figure in football history, and they all played in an era, and there's some other quarterbacks from the 70s that have that lower pass rating, and Phil Simms played in an era where there was just frankly, it was a great era for quarterbacks, and so comparing him to some of his contemporaries, he doesn't quite have the numbers. So I'm with you. He'd probably get a boost in his numbers and probably just make it in if he didn't have sort of those on and off injuries throughout his career.
But I do think he had Hall of Fame talent.
Sure.
And had things gone according to plan in the 1979 draft, I think he would have been a Hall of Famer. And in 1979, we all know that he was coming out as a quarterback. He went to Morehead State in Kentucky, Division II, or at the time, I think it's called it's FCS now. I think it was 1AA at the time. The plan was that Bill Walsh wanted to draft him to the 49ers. And Bill Walsh was like, I can get this guy, nobody knows about him. I can get him in like the second round, maybe the early third round. And I'm going to draft Phil Simms to be my quarterback. And he's my dude. And then the Giants stepped up and picked him 7th overall. And he got booed out of Madison Square Garden when they were doing the draft. Like, people were furious that they picked Phil Simms. Giants fans went nuts. And who else went nuts was Bill Walsh, because that was the guy that he wanted, even though he ended up drafting Joe Montana that draft, and Joe Montana became his quarterback. He really wanted Phil Simms, but the 49ers didn't have a first-round pick because they had traded it away to get O.J. Simpson several years earlier. So O.J. was the end of Phil Simms' Hall of Fame career, because he would have been just as effective, if not more, than Joe Montana in Bill Walsh's offense. But Bill Parcells just had to hand the ball off too much. It was not enough possessions, too much running, too slow a tempo in order for him to amass those numbers, even though I think he could have under a different head coach and a different offensive coordinator.
Right, yeah. The fact that the optics detract from Phil Simms, because that Giants team throughout that entire era was all defense first, right? With Lawrence Taylor,
Carl Banks,
and with Julius Peppers.
No, Julius Peppers was Manning. That was way later.
Yeah. Getting my ears mixed up, but anyway, it was defense first, and I think that hurts Phil Simms. Do you have I was wondering if you had a kind of a current quarterback you compare Phil Simms to that's playing right now that you can think of off the top of your head?
Who would he be like? That's a tough question.
I was thinking maybe like a Joe Flacco type.
Yeah, he's got very similar career numbers to Joe Flacco. So although I think he's got better accuracy than Flacco, and I think that he's more mobile than Flacco. And I think that part of the reason that Flacco and he have similar numbers is because Flacco plays more in a passing era than he does.
When I think of Joe Flacco, and for me, he's kind of always my more contemporary go-to of a quarterback that was better on the field than his numbers reflect. His control of the game, his IQ of the game, kind of how he read the field. I don't think that always comes through in the statistics that a quarterback puts up.
Yeah, ultimately, it's about wins. And when you look at the quarterbacks that maybe he was compared against, Phil Simms, in his career, he went 95-64. Randall Cunningham was 82-52, and Joe Theismann was 77-47. So he won more than those guys, even though those guys, had better numbers per se. Not so much Theismann, but Randall Cunningham outperforms Phil Simms on just about every statistic except winning and championships. And it all goes back to, I don't think we're banging down the door of the hall to let Randall Cunningham in. And so I feel like we probably shouldn't be doing that for Phil Simms. And even Phil Simms came out and said, I'm not worthy of the Hall of Fame. Now, when you take his entire body of work and all of the years that he has been in broadcasting and you compile them together, then you may have a case for his contribution to football as a whole. But strictly as a player, then that would still be a no from me. But I would be willing to say, on the John Madden scale of what he's meant overall to his career, beyond just like John Madden coaching, is John Madden as a football ambassador and broadcaster, then I can say that really makes the argument, a different argument and a different conversation about Phil Simms.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, let's move on. We had some baseball, and we're going back to 1915, where on June 17th, Cubs reliever Zip Zabel took over for the starting pitcher with 2 outs in the first inning and set an MLB record for relief innings when he went 18 1/3 innings in a 19-inning affair. Chicago beat the Brooklyn Robins 4-3. It was still pretty early in Zip Zabel's career, but 1915 would be his final year. He'd start developing arm trouble. And he would retire at the end, and he had a record of 12-14 and a 2.71 respectable ERA. But not a long career, but a footnote in baseball history that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I can't believe you didn't ask me what I remember about this game. I did not see this game, but Zip Zabel, I'll tell you what stuck out to me in your 18 1/3 innings of relief. He had 1 walk, Jeff. 1. And that was an intentional walk of Casey Stengel. Yes, that Casey Stengel. And yeah, 1 walk in 18 1/3. Like, forget about it that it's one game. Like, if you have 18 1/3 relief innings over like 2 or 3 weeks and you don't give up, you'll give up only 1 walk, I'm loving you. You do that in one game, I really, really love you, Zip Zabel. And unfortunately, the world was stacked against Zip Zabel and his inability to craft a large or a longer major league career. But I'm not sleeping on 2.70 ERA. That's legit.
Some of the articles about him talk about his arm trouble, and everyone will point to his 18 1/3 inning. You probably don't want to let a pitcher go that long. But actually, he was visiting a doctor in the season prior. And so it wasn't that he necessarily developed arm trouble after this game. This game probably exacerbated the arm trouble that he had in terms of health. And he had visited someone named Bonesetter Reese.
Nice.
John Bonesetter Reese, which is now my favorite doctor nickname of all time. Bonesetter Reese. Bonesetter Reese was a Welsh-born doctor who lived in Youngstown, Ohio, and he would deal with strains and joint problems, so he would set your bones. Mm-hmm. He actually was not a licensed doctor, and he would be if it was in today's era, he would be like a physical therapist, chiropractor. Mm-hmm. But he was so well regarded that the Ohio State Legislature gave him a pass on his medical license. He didn't need to have a medical license because he was doing such great work. And he actually was visited by Honus Wagner, Cy Young, Ty Cobb, Rogers Hornsby, all the great players of the day, some boxers, some football players. And so, Zip Zabel was visiting Bonesetter Reese in 1914. So, he probably had a lot of these arm injuries that, we see now in, players' younger careers where before they even get up to the majors, or they have an incident earlier, maybe in the rookie year, and they have an issue. But kind of makes you think about sort of how injuries are handled nowadays compared to that era.
And another part of the problem that he had was that he refused to not go to college. So he would go to college all the way up until it was, spring, end of spring, May, and then he would go right to the major leagues and start playing with no spring training whatsoever. And so he had that going against him, that he didn't really have any training or a very modified version of it before he ended up on the big league mound, which I'm sure did not help his arm. And he probably could have played a bit longer, but he got World War I happened, and while he was given a draft exemption because he had stayed in school and gotten his degree and he was a chemist, he went to work for Fairbanks Morse, which was building and developing ship engines that were used by the Navy for World War I. And so he did that all throughout World War I. And by the time he was out, by the time the war was over, his sort of baseball life and dream had passed him by. And he ended up being very much like Moonlight Graham in Field of Dreams. That's sort of the life he had in the community that he had been a part of. But he could have been with the Pirates instead of going to college, because he was scouted when he was playing with the Cheyenne Indians, and the Pittsburgh Pirates wanted him in order to go right to the big leagues when he was, probably 18, 19 years old. And he went 36-2 when he was with Cheyenne, with 328 strikeouts in 49 games. So,
wow,
that's legit. No matter where, even if you're playing in Cheyenne, that's legit.
That is legit.
But you always think, well, hey, what if he had not gone to school? What if he had just been a Pirate? Maybe he wouldn't have had those arm problems that were created by that long layoff while he was at school.
Yeah, it's funny. That era in sports is so wacky at times. I pulled up some kind of interesting sports feats during about 1890 to 1920. And I think in baseball, a lot of fans are pretty familiar with Cy Young throwing 7,000 innings and having 40 complete games, multiple seasons of 40 wins. Babe Ruth's home run numbers, right, took off when really there wasn't a lot of power in baseball. But, getting away from baseball, there's some pretty crazy sports feats that kind of fly under the radar, but I wanted to share a couple of my favorite with you. There was someone named Lionel Strongford. That was his actual name.
Nice.
And he did planking. And in fact, in 1900, like just after 1900, he did planking where he would act as a human bridge, and he would let a car drive over him.
Nice.
So, and then another one is Arthur Saxton. He did the one-arm bent press, where they kind of lean down and hold the barbell up with one arm. 371 pounds.
Oh wow, that's good.
That's pretty.
Was it the one with the round dumbbell, like the old strong man at the circus used to have?
Exactly. And one other one, just wanted to mention, John Holtum. In 1890, he would stand in front of a cannon, and they'd fire a cannonball at him, and he would catch it. So those are some of my favorite athletic feats from that era.
Nice.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's move on. We're going to go to talking a little more about baseball and something more recent than 1915. In 1986, the White Sox On June 20th, GM Hawk Harrelson fired Tony La Russa and hired Jim Fregosi to manage the rest of the season. La Russa would then get hired that same season by the Oakland A's, which more people are familiar with him as part of the A's. And they'd finish their season the rest of the way, going 45-34. The A's had been mired in mediocrity up to that point, but they'd finished the next season with La Russa at the helm playing .500 ball. And then, as most people are aware, in 1988, they'd win the pennant, go on to the World Series. They'd be in the World Series the 2 years after that as well. So, in hindsight, maybe not the best decision to fire Tony La Russa from the Chicago White Sox.
Yeah, maybe not. But let's also say for Tony La Russa, wasn't it great for him that he inherited such a better team than what the White Sox were? And that's not to say that Tony La Russa couldn't develop talent, because he came in when the White Sox were pretty terrible, and he got them to the American League Championship Series in 1983. They lost to Baltimore, who ended up winning the World Series that year. But he really had a good team already sort of in place in Oakland, and then he picked up some pretty good free agents, got Dave Parker, and then he had 3 years worth of Rookie of the Year. He had Canseco in 86, McGuire 87, and Walt Weiss in 88. And 88 is when they made it to the World Series for the first time. And if it hadn't been for one Kirk Gibson, who knows how the rest of that series would have played out. They may have gotten back-to-back World Series championships. But it was the start of something really good for Oakland. They won 89 in the Earthquake Series. And then they went on and they lost to the Cincinnati Reds in 1990. But that was a really good era for the Oakland A's. And I'm sure if you ask Tony La Russa, which people have, was he happy to be in Oakland? And the answer, of course, was yes. That just when you think things are terrible and you may never get another chance, when the door opens, he took it.
Yeah, and Jerry Reinsdorf, owner of the White Sox, reflects back and says that was probably one of the biggest mistakes that he allowed to happen to his team. Hawk Harrelson only lasted 1 year as a GM. And then some of the accounts afterwards were that him and Tony La Russa really clashed. And La Russa was pretty young during that time, at the time when he was first hired as the White Sox manager. He was only 34, 35. And then he had a very successful 1983 season. And then it was a little bit up and down from 83. So, 1986, it was still pretty early in the season, could have righted the ship. I actually was looking at the roster, and they had some interesting players. Well, they had an aging Carlton Fisk on that team, but Harold Baines was pretty solid on that team. They had a young Bobby Bonilla. They had Ozzie Guillen at short. The one thing that really jumped out at me, although really at the end of their career, is that they had Tom Seaver and Steve Carlton on that team, although at different times, because Seaver would get traded, and then Carlton would be picked up after getting signed and released by a couple teams earlier in the season. Both were age 41 when they joined the White Sox, or when they were on that White Sox roster in that season. But interesting roster, some big names that kind of jump out, some people at the end of their careers. But yeah, you're right. And the other thing about, I think Reinsdorf felt, I don't know if it's guilt or what it was, but he did bring back Tony La Russa after his Cardinals stint. He had retired initially in 2011, and then Reinsdorf, the following decade brought back Tony La Russa for a couple of years. That was, and when he finished his second stint with the White Sox in the early 2020s, he was second all time in wins behind Connie Mack.
Yeah, and he's also second all time in losses as well, and doesn't have the world's greatest winning percentage. He's down at 82nd all time at 536, so just over 500. But he and Hawk Harrelson, they were friends for a long time, and had a huge rift in their relationship when he was GM, and a lot of it had to do with Tom Seaver in that Hawk Harrelson wanted to trade Tom Seaver in spring training, and they had argued and fought about that. And Tony La Russa was like, well, we're never going to make a go of it this year if we don't keep Tom Seaver. And as soon as Tony La Russa was gone and that extra static and extra noise, Tom Seaver was gone later on in that year. So it's a fortunate happening for Oakland and maybe unfortunate for the White Sox. I feel like that Hawk Harrelson was really the problem out of the three of them, of Reinsdorf and La Russa and Hawk Harrelson. The one who was out of their element was Hawk Harrelson, who is a fantastic play-by-play guy and one of my favorite broadcasters ever. But he was not a very good GM. And that really showed. And what's odd enough, too, is I believe, didn't Harold Baines go to Oakland during the Tony La Russa era of Oakland? I think he ended up coming over there. I don't know if it was that year or the year after, but
yeah, I think so. I have an image of him in the Oakland A's uniform, and also Dave Duncan was La Russa's pitching coach during that time as well, and he also was getting into it with Hawk Harrelson. So clearly, it was like you said. I agree. Hawk Harrelson seemed to be out.
And Duncan ended up going with La Russa. At least he was for sure in St. Louis, and I believe he was in Oakland as well. So
yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap it up with something kind of fun. It's kind of an amazing feat when we talk about Edwin Moses. So on June 16th in 1984, at the Olympic trials, Edwin Moses won his 100th consecutive 400-meter hurdles, and he'd end up winning 122 straight races, having this streak snapped on June 4th, 1987. That's a streak of 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days. Jackpot. He would qualify for the Olympics and win gold in 1984 for Team USA. But amazing feat. Edwin Moses, probably the GOAT of the hurdles, 400-meter hurdles. Where do you place him, and sort of how do you compare him to other track stars?
Well, I think that as soon as you mention name the greatest track athletes ever, that Edwin Moses immediately enters my brain as somebody that needs to be talked about. And for what he did from the late 70s up until I think it was 1977 when it started. He did win the gold medal in 76 as well, and he probably would have won in 1980 if the U.S. hadn't boycotted. So he would have 3 gold medals, and he ended up adding a bronze in 1988. But what's amazing is in winning all of those races, that's not just finals. That's him winning preliminaries and him winning semifinals, which you don't have to do. You don't have to win the preliminaries in the heats, and you don't have to win the semifinal in order to get into the final. And you'll see a lot of people conserve, or you see the guys let up at the end, and the placing doesn't matter so much. It mattered to Edwin Moses, and to be able to win all of those preliminaries and all of those semifinals and all of those finals. He is right up at the top of certainly American track stars for me, and very high on all sports when I think about how impressive that streak is. I can only really think of a couple of people that I would put ahead of him in terms of what they did in terms of a streak above Edwin Moses.
Yeah, and he really revolutionized that sport, right? He had a background in physics and some knowledge in engineering. So he took a very technical approach to how the event was run. And up to that point, hurdlers usually took 14 steps. He reduced it to creating this 13-step pattern, allows him to really maximize his rhythm, conserve energy, reduce contact times. And that improved his stride, his speed, efficiency, and his stamina. And it was revolutionary for the sport during that time, right?
Yeah, it certainly was. Not just his training method, but how he prepared and tried to replicate the same race on every track in every condition with his stride pattern. But where he really made his mark was off the track, and he was part of the group that created the Athletes Trust Fund, which worked with the IAAF, which is the governing body of track, and the IOC in order to allow athletes to start making money and receive stipends and receive help financially in order to continue training, because we were still in that quasi-professional, not professional world in the mid-'80s, where if you weren't one of the, quote-unquote military athletes like was happening in Eastern Europe and in Russia, it was very hard for you to have enough funding to complete your training. And so he worked with the IOC to create ways around that and still maintain the amateurism that was required at the time, which was just the bridge to full out professionalism by about 1988. And he also worked with WADA and the IAAF to create drug testing protocols as one of the advocates to fight doping within the sport. And he helped create the modern drug test for athletes and create the non-competition random drug test policies that have gone into effect not just in track and field, but in a number of other sports. So not just a pioneer on what he did on the track, but a really influential figure in track and field and the Olympic movement over the past 35, 40 years.
Yeah, and so for everyone out there who's wondering, 122, can you give me a sort of frame of reference of like how just how long that is? So I think more recent sports fans know Usain Bolt. Everyone's saying, oh, Usain Bolt, right? He was the best. That's what a lot of people will remember. He only produced a streak of 45 straight wins. And then sort of an era before Usain Bolt, you have Michael Johnson. Although these are different sports that they're competing in, but Michael Johnson had an 8-year stretch in the 400 meter of 58 wins, straight wins. And then stepping outside of track, if we, some of the other more dominant teams in sports history, UConn women's basketball, they won 111 straight games. And so you just look at sort of comparing to other sports, and it really is hard to find something that compares to the streak that Edwin Moses put up.
The only two that I have that come close is Sugar Ray Robinson, who went 91 fights without a loss. He went 89. He had 2 draws, so 91 fight streak from 1943 to 1951 without a loss. And the greatest ever, Alexander Karelinen, the heavyweight Greco-Roman wrestler, who lost in 1987 and didn't lose again until 2000.
Wow.
Went 887-2 over that time, and that was the one he lost in 77 and the one that he lost in 2000. And over the last 6 years of that streak, he did not surrender a single point in a single match for the final 6 years of that streak. Unfortunately for him, the final loss, the one that broke the streak, was in the Olympic final in Sydney. Tough place to have that happen, right?
That is unfortunate.
Yeah, so he has 3 golds and a silver instead of 4 gold medals. But yeah, 887-2 over 13 years. That's getting it done, Jeff.
I can just imagine the fans who don't really follow the sport that much, but they show up to the Olympics and they're like, this guy is the best. It's going to be dominance, and then they watch him lose.
And then he lost. Yeah, he loses 1-0. 1-0. The only point he's given up in 6 years.
Everyone told me he's the best.
Alexander Karelinen. He is a beast.
All right, Clayton. Well, we're going to call it there. I want to thank everyone for checking out our episode this week. I want to thank you, Clayton, for always sharing your knowledge and your history insights. Just remember, everyone, there's a new history post up every day. Check it out on our Facebook, on our Substack at Sports and Leisure. Follow us on YouTube, comment, share the knowledge, because as much as we love talking about history, we love sharing it even more. All right, take it easy, Clayton.
All right, you too, man.
Next time.